All right, joining me for a new series that I'm just going to call Kabul, basically talking about cobbling the information together that has been going on in Kabul, is an expert on the topic, Kristy Perano. I've had her on the show before talking about her effort to get a veteran stateside. Kristy, thank you for joining me again.
Well, thanks for having me again.
So let's just make this open-ended as possible. What the heck is going on?
Well, I mean, I was one of the what used to be a minority of people that said that a full withdrawal from Afghanistan was not a good idea, and that has, in hindsight, we quickly saw what can happen when the U.S. leaves an area and doesn't have an adequate support system in place. Apparently, the Trump administration, at least, and presumably the Biden administration, planned to have some behind the scenes support for the Afghan government and at least keep Kabul under government control. But what ended up happening was as U.S. troops withdrew, I think a combination of the Afghan government was really weakened by the peace deal where the Trump administration had gone in and kind of given the Taliban recognition, and they strong-armed the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban terrorists, supposedly who agreed not to go to the battlefield, which of course lasted a couple of days and they were back on the battlefield. And also, but the Trump administration initially started to address Pakistan and their support for terrorism, but then kind of got distracted by other things. So I think Nikki Haley at the beginning of the Trump administration really started to go after the whole supporting the Taliban under the table, but there wasn't a lot of follow through in the second half of the Trump administration. So once they decided that we were going to be friends with the Taliban, they sort of stopped trying to deal with Pakistan's under the table support. You also have Iran and Pakistan that are both sending significant supporting terrorism groups in Afghanistan and sending troops and military equipment over the border. So the setup going into a couple months ago was that the U.S. had about 10,000 soldiers there not too long ago and had drawn down to 2,500. And then we had this peace deal where we strong arm the Afghan government to release 5,000 terrorists. We give the Taliban some validity. We do nothing about Iran and Pakistan shipping their terrorists over the border for a proxy war. So now the Afghan military, and also from some of this analysis I've read, oftentimes it doesn't address the proxy war issue, like Pakistan support for the Taliban. But what has been commented on is that the U.S. didn't really do a great job of teaching the Afghans how to manage and support their own military. So it was more of just teaching them to be foot soldiers and less of teaching them to coordinate stuff. So there was this plan that as their fighter jets needed repairs, they were going to have to ship them to other countries to get U.S. contractors to repair them. And I think there were significant concerns even from the beginning that was going to be unsustainable. So there was also
yeah, no, that's dense. That's really dense. That's a lot of information to process there, but I hope everyone was able to catch that. But go on.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like there's a whole number of facets to this as to why did Afghanistan collapse so quickly. And I think it's not, and the popular thing to do now is to say that, well, clearly this meant that it was all going to collapse even with our troops there, or say, well, Afghans need to learn to fight. But I think if you look at our failure to really teach them to be self-sufficient, our failure to address the rest of the world sending their terrorists to Afghanistan, we had really set them up for a suicide mission and they ended up opting out. In most cases, there were apparently some behind the scenes deals with the Taliban where it was okay, we'll just give you this province when you show up, and then the U.S. is oh, what happened? Afghans don't really want to fight the Taliban. I'm sure there were plenty of people in the Afghan National Army that maybe don't really care that much either way. It's hey, if you're on the government's payroll, you fight for the government, you can go join the Taliban, fight for them. I mean, I'm sure there is some of that going on, but I think it's totally unfair to the Afghan people to just say, when there was so much that had gone wrong and so much that we failed to do to support them, I think it's totally unfair to say Afghans all support the Taliban, Afghans don't want to fight. And the Afghans have lost tens of thousands of lives fighting the Taliban in recent years. So it's not that they were unwilling to fight. I think it's more of just that the West's failure to address the proxy war and stop the rest of the entire world from sending their terrorists to Afghanistan to kill Afghans, and failure to provide them the logistical support they needed to actually be able to fight led to just the Afghan security forces were just demoralized, and they didn't see that it was a winnable war for them, so they decided to try to make a deal with the devil and save themselves. The Taliban has no honor, so I'm not even sure like how many. Maybe they won't go in, and I don't even know like how many of these people that they claimed they'd spare they will or not. I mean, they say, oh yeah, we're the new Taliban, we're more modern, we're gonna spare, we're not gonna retaliate against people, but like they are, and they're gonna continue to. I think for the week or so since they took Kabul, they have been killing some like U.S. allies, but there's some sort of deal with the U.S. where they're not supposed to do too much damage. So they're more like threatening and harassing, and not. I'm confident that they're killing some, but they're not like openly like mass executing people in Kabul yet, because they are trying to like. I don't know exactly what the U.S. is probably more of a bribe than a threat that the U.S. gave them, but they're trying to like improve their image a little bit. So they're going to wait until a lot of the international observers are gone before they start like mass killing people would be my.
But it's clear that whatever agreement, that implicit agreement that the U.S. has like with the Taliban, that the Taliban is ultimately going to regard it as a la font de papier, a piece of paper. That was
right,
actually. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say that's how for those you don't know, that's how the German chancellor in 1914 referred to the agreement that Poland would be neutral in the in the what's called the First World War. That was how Germany referred to that agreement, and to justify their invasion of Poland. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think like the Doha peace deal, I think was very flawed, and I said so at the time. But then even what small concessions the Taliban made, they've pretty much broken every single one except for the one about not attacking Western countries, but that's the only one they don't yet have the resources to break. So I think it's complete folly to think that, like they said they were going to break ties with Al Qaeda, they haven't. I mean, they said they weren't going to attack cities. Obviously, they did. They said they weren't going to, they were going to have a reduction in violence. Obviously, they didn't. They were going to have more respect for women's rights. They're like shooting women in Kabul for not, being conservatively dressed enough. So there is no legitimate evidence that the Taliban has reformed. That we have some sort of new Taliban that just wants women to cover up more, but otherwise is somewhat supportive of human rights. So yeah, I also think it's folly for the West to think that we're somehow safe from what's going on in Afghanistan. I mean, now you have millions of people that no longer are going to be able to live in Afghanistan. So now you have created a massive refugee crisis, because a significant portion of 40 million Afghans that don't want to live in Afghanistan or can't live in Afghanistan. But even aside from that, I am not optimistic about, unless the U.S. may be aggressive might end up trying to expand a military presence in neighboring countries, but I'm not very optimistic about not having Al Qaeda and ISIS and all of that back in Afghanistan and targeting the U.S. like we were 20 years ago. So I mean, we're basically just reset Afghanistan to 20 years ago, and except that now the Taliban has more territory and the best military equipment money can buy, compliments of U.S. taxpayers. So yeah, I am not at all optimistic about the world getting serious about controlling terror in Afghanistan. And yeah, it wasn't like anyone liked the situation where there was ongoing fighting with the Taliban and so many U.S. soldiers having to support it, but the solution was to deal with Pakistan and try to keep them from sending thousands of terrorists to Afghanistan every year, not to pull out all of our troops and just let the Taliban and Al Qaeda take over Afghanistan, as they pretty quickly did.
I definitely want to get to Pakistan. I just want to quickly address the situation on the ground as of right now. Last I heard, apparently there's a situation at Kabul airport that the Taliban is actually not letting people through, but apparently evacuation flights have picked up in the last 2 or 3 days. Are you able to, is that what the information you're getting right now?
Yeah, it is extremely difficult to get accurate information on what's going on because you have governments like intentionally giving a rosier picture than what's really on the ground. And then there is a lot of, I mean, I have a lot of firsthand sources of like SIVs I'm in contact with, or some that I've known for a long time, and some that have like reached out more recently that are like giving situational reports of what's going on. And sometimes it's just completely contradictory. It's like the State Department says that we evacuated like 8,000 people in the last 24 hours, and then other people are saying, well, we're here at the airport, we haven't seen any planes in a day. And I'm like, I don't know. Obviously, someone is wrong because there can't be 8,000 people that got airlifted and no planes. And it's really, I don't think the State Department is totally fabricating the data about like how many people they've evacuated. So it may be that, I don't know, that they stopped letting people into the airport because they already had enough people in there. And that's why, I have people saying, oh, well, they're not doing the evacuation anymore. Maybe just that they're not taking any more people into the airport, but planes are still leaving. But yeah, so what you have like around 5,000 or so US troops. I think there are some in other areas, but a lot of them are in the Kabul airport, and they're securing the perimeter of the airport. And if somebody has been like approved to get on an evacuation flight in the next couple of days, then they're let into the secure area of the airport. And they're supposed to be notified by the State Department and said, okay, if you're a citizen or a green card holder, or if you are a visa applicant who has been notified that you're now travel eligible, you can show up to the gate. But the problem is, to get to the gate, you have like the Taliban, then you have sort of this middle, quote, safe zone, which is really not safe at all, like outside of the US. And then outside of that, you have a bunch of Taliban checkpoints. Now, the Taliban is supposed to be like letting citizens and residents through, but I don't know. I don't think they've actually killed an American citizen. They have beaten them. They've like blocked them from access. And so it's not like the Taliban is behaving themselves. I mean, they haven't beheaded anyone trying to get to the airport that I know of, but there have been people that have been shot. There have been people that have been, crushed and died of heat stroke and stuff like this. So it's not like there have been no casualties at the airport, but we haven't. And then there have been people caught in the crossfire between sometimes Afghan security forces and the Taliban exchange fire. So yeah, I think there was some happy talk from President Biden a couple days ago about how good the Taliban was being, and they're letting all these American citizens in. But like the reality is that they haven't killed anyone yet, but they've beaten American citizens. They've blocked them from access. They're like charging people $1,000 to let them into the airport. So it really is quite a disaster over there. And then, I mean, a lot of people are in the middle zone. To the best I can tell, like, it is extremely difficult to get accurate information on who has even been evacuated. I can say anecdotally, it's not a whole lot of translators yet. I'm in touch with a lot of them I know of a couple that did get out, that were like very towards the end of their visa stages, and one of them was evacuated a few days ago, is in the US now. Another one just, I think, a day and a half ago. It wasn't someone I knew very well, but I had like given him a little bit of advice on like how to try to make sure he was on the list. And then he said, good news, I'm in the airport, thanks for your help. And so that was really nice to know that, I hadn't made any real material contribution to it, but it was nice to know that at least one of the guys that I'd, been in touch with had a positive resolution. But I still have a whole number that I'm in touch with that were towards the end of the visa process that are supposed to be able to be evacuated, and they just can't get to the airport. So they have the State Department permission to go to the airport, but there's thousands of, it's like the Taliban and then a mob of thousands of people, and you just can't get to the airport. And what seems to have happened was that first well-publicized flight of like 800 some Afghans, it seems like they were not people that were on a particular evacuation list. They were Afghans that were just sort of hanging around the airport, and someone was just like, all right, let's just get them out of our hair. We'll put them on a plane and fly them to Qatar. So that was not a like State Department sanctioned evacuation. I think that was just some US military people that just wanted to get some Afghans out of the airport, so they stuck them on a plane.
Right.
And then I think that could have been the same flight where people were like crowding around, and some people tried to climb on the outside of the plane and fell off. And so I mean, it could have been, I'm not absolutely positive it was the same flight that had the like 800 some people on board. But then what ended up happening was, because of that, now everybody thought, oh, well, gee, if I don't want to stay in Afghanistan, all you need to do is go to the airport and you might be able to get on a plane. So now you have everybody in Afghanistan who doesn't want to be in Afghanistan anymore trying to go to the airport. And you have like SIVs, some of which are like not special immigrant visa applicants, but some of them are not far enough along in the process. They're supposed to be able to fly, but they show up at the airport hoping that they can get on a plane before they get murdered in the next few days. And then you have people that just want to leave Afghanistan, and you have citizens and green card holders that can't get to the gate. So it's really a lot of chaos, and they'll have different gates that they'll open from time to time, and then people try to go there. And theoretically, if you like are on the State Department list and you can prove that you're on the evac list already, you can go there and present your documents and they let you in. But in reality, most of these people can't even get to the gate because of throngs of people crowding around. And the rumor is that Afghan security people are just sort of picking which people they want to go through. So, and again, it's really hard to substantiate this, but it's like, oh, they're letting their friends and family in. I would suspect there's some corruption. I'd suspect that there's some like, friends and family or people that pay a $5,000 bribe get put on a plane by Afghan security. I think a lot of what's happening is why a lot of interpreters haven't been evacuated is because the US government is prioritizing citizens and green card holders. So they have gotten quite a few of those out of Afghanistan. And then there's also this curious category for the last few days, and it was 7,500 other nationalities. They said third party nationality / other. And what I'm being told is that that's probably some like governmental, some like basically it's sort of a division of the Afghan army that was put under that other category. And what I don't really understand is why didn't they get them there and then put their uniforms back on and say, here, you can help guard the airport and then you'll be on the last flight out. Like why, to me, that would make more sense than prioritizing them over the other potentially more vulnerable people. But anyway, I think to the best of my knowledge in the last few days, there's been like 16,000 people or somewhere between 11 to 17,000 people, depending on like the time frame. And I think it's been about like 7,000 some of other country nationalities, probably that the US is aiding and airlifting, and these like Afghan security, these other category. Other might also include friends and family of security forces that were not on an official evacuation list. And then there's been a couple thousand US citizens, maybe potentially including green card holders. There's also family members of US citizens and green card holders. I'm not sure how they get counted. And then you have like 1,100 or so interpreters and interpreters' family members. So it's still a small fraction. I am hearing that the expectation is that it will increase, like the number of actual military interpreters being evacuated. They're going to be a much bigger portion of the evacuees over the coming days than they have been over the last few days, which I mean would be welcome news for me and other interpreter advocates, since those are the people that we personally know. And then the other thing I'm hearing, and that I'm starting to hear both from the government and from sources on the ground, is that they are implementing a new system where they are going out and picking up people with buses, because despite the happy talk about how nice the Taliban's being, we know that they're not. So they're like notifying people, okay, it's your turn to come to the airport, and then they're going to go pick them up in a bus and take them through the Taliban controlled areas in a bus. And I think other countries like France, maybe, at least Britain, have been doing this for several days, and the US is just like, oh, just figure out how to get to the airport if you want to get home. And now they've kind of realized that that has been leading to a lot of issues. I think what remains unaddressed is what to do with all these people in this middle zone. I mean, I think they need to establish more security, because the Taliban is going in there and like beating people and harassing people and threatening people that are just like waiting to get into the airport. So I think there should be less tolerance for Taliban harassment. And I think they should just process those people. Like if you have someone who really is supposed to like secure the middle zone and at least provide some water for the people there, and then go through and say, okay, you do have some established connection to the US and you will be eligible to evacuate, but you might need to wait a week. Or if it's someone that has no connection to the US and is like, hey, they don't really want to live in Afghanistan anymore, but they may need to find another way to get out of the country, because like the US evacuation effort I am wholeheartedly supportive of a large evacuation effort because of people who effectively have a death sentence because of their affiliation with us. But I don't think, nor do I think many people would think, that everybody who wants to leave Afghanistan is entitled to leave. So it should we should be doing a large evacuation, but it should be focused on the people who are going to actually be targeted by the Taliban, and not just people that may not wish to live under the Taliban but aren't in any particular danger, compared to everyone else compared to their countrymen.
I encourage everyone to rewind that, give all that a second listen, and a third one. But basically, the one-word summary of that would be, it's a fustercluck.
Yeah.
Is that's what it sounds like?
Yeah, and it's really frustrating too. There is so much misinformation, and I have all these interpreters saying that, oh, well, they're never going to evacuate us, which I think in most cases they will get evacuated, but I don't know when. And it's also extremely frustrating that the Biden administration has not been clear on, like, they would say, they give these speeches, and like, I think a few weeks ago, like in late July, when they finally said they were doing an evacuation, President Biden was like, look, if you worked for us, your home is here. And which would make it sound like you were actually going to take all US military interpreters, right? But then what we were being told by State Department sources was that, well, we actually don't have room for more than 30% of the people already in the application process. Now, I know a lot of people that are not in this top 30% that already achieved. There's this, it's called Chief of Mission Approval, and basically it's like the State Department signing off on, yes, we don't know that we've done some background checks and you passed that, and we agree that you provided documentation of your work for the US military. So that's about 30% or so of applicants that have reached this Chief of Mission Approval. The other 70% have not. And apparently the Trump administration was like playing funny games to try to stall out the first stage process. And the Biden administration has made efforts to streamline it, but you can't fix multiple years of problems that predated Trump. There were lots of issues during the Obama administration as well. So the Trump administration, for the most part, did try to make the SIV process slower and more cumbersome rather than improving it. But also it was already slow and cumbersome before Trump ever came along. So it was not possible, and advocates have been saying since January, it is not possible to catch up. No matter how good a job you try to do, you can't catch up a multi-year backlog in a few months. So the Biden administration has done a better job of processing SIVs, but there was no realistic way they were going to catch up. And they just didn't want to be bothered with having to evacuate as many people because I think they didn't really want to bring them to the US, because then we'd have to, because then I think probably two reasons. One is that it would cost more for us to support them, and two is that they then have to deport someone, and that triggers certain legal protections for these people if they once set foot on American soil. And I think the US didn't really want that either. So they didn't want to be bothered with having to house and feed tens of thousands or 100,000 people. And they also didn't want to be bothered with having to deal with the legal implications of letting them come to American soil. So then they start shopping around for different countries to evacuate people to, and no one was really cooperative. So then they're like, well, I guess we'll put a few thousand in a couple military bases, and then Qatar is going to take 8,000, and that's it. Unfortunately, we can't evacuate any more than that. And this was like,
is Qatar really going to take 8,000?
They might. I'm not, right now they're kind of a staging ground. I'm not sure. I think it's like sort of adjacent to a U.S. military base, and maybe it's only going to be 4,000 or something that stay there. But basically, they just couldn't find countries that wanted to house all these Afghan refugees. They're like, oh well, guess we're not going to be able to evacuate very many. And this was when they were publicly saying we're going to evacuate everyone, but then they were, or making it sound like they're going to evacuate everyone, and then they were privately saying, actually, we can only do 30%. But then I think what ended up changing the dynamic was just in the last few days, it became clear that there is no claiming that Afghanistan is stable. There's no claiming that, oh, well, hey, they can just hang out in Kabul for a couple of months and we'll finish processing their visa. Like, there's
right,
no.
Because Kabul's like a great place to hang out right now.
Right.
I want to let you keep talking. I think we're under a bit of a time crunch, so I definitely want to keep the conversation moving. Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, you talked about the Biden administration, you talked about the Trump administration, and I have to say that this is something I think that some of my I think friends on the right wanted me to ask, which is that I said that by Super Tuesday last year that I was going to support Biden over Trump because I figured he was the better choice, and I think it was the best choice put forward. After this past week, I have to admit that it's the first time that I have been second guessing that choice. It is have such thoughts like come into your head like maybe I should have like wrote in someone or maybe consider like a third party candidate. Is has what happened this week like been grounds to have thoughts like that?
I would say yes, because, and I actually ended up writing in someone. Like, I live in California. There's absolutely zero possibility of
Right.
helping choose the president. Um, but yeah, I would say yes. I think this. I mean, I have actually spoken with Democratic staffers in high level positions that have been like, this is the most shameful thing our country has done in decades. So there's a lot of outrage, like even, and there are a few Democrats like Chris Murphy that have led the charge of like doing a partisan defense of
Yeah.
Biden and claiming that this is all inevitable, which
But
is nonsense.
yeah, people are like comparing this to Saigon, when in reality, what's happening in Afghanistan is making Saigon look like a peaceful British retreat.
Right. Yeah, and the thing was that there was and it's like, oh, we prepared for every scenario. Well, no, you didn't. Like, they did not anticipate Kabul was going to fall this quickly. But even though they said that, oh well, we think it'll take a few months before the Taliban takes over Afghanistan. But even if that's the case, like, why wouldn't you be making every effort to get your people out of there before the whole house of cards potentially falls down? Even if you think it's going to take 3 months instead of 1 week. So yeah, so I don't think there's any excuse for how this was handled by the Biden administration. Like, this was kind of the worst case scenario in terms of how fast everything collapsed. But that's why. But even if it wasn't as bad as it is, it would still have been bad enough that we should have taken action to tell our citizens and green card holders, like, look, U.S. troops are going to be here securing the airport until August 31st. You need to get home before then. But the State Department didn't bother to tell U.S. citizens to leave Afghanistan until 2 days before, or 2 or 3 days before.
That's 9 days from now. How are they going to do it?
Oh, the August 31st. Yeah. Well, now they're doing this big airlift, and I think there's some indication, like President Biden was like, we may end up having to extend this. So I think they probably are going to end up extending the airlift, just because there's so many people they have to get out, and because there have been so many, as we discussed, logistical challenges, and planes have been leaving half full because they're not getting people in and processed fast enough. So yeah, I suspect they're going to end up extending this. But yeah, what it really upsets me, that it would have upset me if any president did this, but like President Biden campaigned on the exact opposite. He campaigned on, I believe we should maintain some troop presence in Afghanistan to keep Afghanistan stable and protect human rights in Afghanistan. And he also campaigned on, Trump betrayed the Kurds. Trump is betraying our allies. We're going to strengthen our relationship with our allies. We're going to support NATO. We're going to improve the SAV. He ran on all of those things. And what he's done is created a much bigger crisis for SAVs than anything that did actually occur during the Trump administration. And I do believe that if Trump had been elected, we would have likely seen a somewhat similar withdrawal and chaos. But that doesn't absolve Biden from responsibility for pulling the trigger on this.
I sometimes wonder if Trump like had been doing this, like, would there be the SIV evacuations that at least are happening now?
It's hard to say, not necessarily, but I wouldn't say for sure that there wouldn't be. The Biden administration, it was much more difficult to convince them to do this than anybody anticipated. So it was like 2 months of nonstop bipartisan pressure. Like, the media pretty much nonstop talking about, we can't leave our allies behind. A huge amount of bipartisan support, senators and congressmen saying we cannot do this, and like a huge amount of pressure from a bunch of different nonprofits over the course of 2 months, and then finally they started doing evacuations. So yes, so I think it's likely Trump would have gone through with the full withdrawal of U.S. troops had he been reelected. I think it's quite possible that he would have not done an evacuation, but it's also it took an extremely high amount of pressure to get the Biden administration to act on that. So you can't say for sure what would have happened in that hypothetical situation. I'm not confident that the Trump administration would have. I would disagree with the people that say, oh, well, gee, if Trump were in charge, everything would have been done orderly. Like, I think Meghan McCain's husband was like, Trump would not
And
have
Dominic.
yeah, like Trump would not have left a single interpreter behind. He absolutely would have, because
Yeah,
his administration made it more difficult to help interpreters
yeah, yeah.
over the
Trump
course
and Obama were I think the worst on that, right?
for interpreters case
Yeah.
for like yeah, I would say so. But then with the Biden administration, it's not they have streamlined the application process a little bit, but they also created this huge disaster over in Afghanistan. But in terms of just visa policy, probably the Biden administration is more favorable than Obama, and definitely more so than Trump. But yeah, I mean, I think Trump does deserve his share of the blame for setting this whole scenario up. But
And negotiating with the Taliban without the input from the Afghan government.
right, yeah. But Biden had an easy out because the Taliban didn't follow any of the things they agreed to. So the Biden administration could, and also it's not a treaty, it's not a legally binding thing. So the Biden administration could have just walked away from the deal like they did with so many other Trump deals and said, that was Trump, but we don't negotiate with terrorists, so sorry. But even if they didn't want to do that, they could have just said, all right, very well, Taliban, you follow your end of the deal, we'll follow our end. And then as soon as the Taliban started attacking cities and stuff like that, then he said, well, you guys aren't following the deal either. So until you start following it, we're not following it. I mean, it was not difficult, but Biden wanted out of Afghanistan too. And the sickening thing is he thought he could he thought he could throw away a few 100,000 people's lives and score political points. And now he has this huge mess on his hands and he's realizing he's losing political points. But yeah, I have no interest. So I am really glad that they're doing a massive evacuation, because that is hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, or even could end up being over 100,000 people whose lives will be saved. So I'm extremely grateful for that. But that does not in any way defend how we got to doing this like absolutely chaotic.
For sure. I got like 3 more questions left. First, I just want to know, like, how tenuous is America's hold on Kabul airport? Is there any danger that the Taliban could overrun the airport?
There have been rumors of ISIS threats on the airport. I suspect that we have enough assets, probably some of which are not being talked about, that the Taliban isn't going to just like surround the airport and slaughter thousands of people. There is definitely very real concern, though, that things could escalate and there could be more of a hot war around the airport. I kind of think that won't happen because I suspect that the U.S. has done some combination of bribing the Taliban and threatening to start bombing stuff if they don't somewhat cooperate. That I'm not really expecting that, but anything is possible.
I promised you we would talk about Pakistan, so I'm going to make good on that. I've sometimes wondered, I had this question from my father last night. He said this was too long a conversation about, so I'm going to throw it to you. When America got attacked on 9/11, should America have invaded Pakistan? Hear me out. Pakistan was the main supporter of the Taliban. Like Taliban is essentially like almost like a client state of the Pakistani government for whatever reason. So I'm wondering, if America takes out Pakistan, does support for the Taliban basically dry up and Taliban collapses on its own and Al Qaeda no longer has their shelter? Like, do you see the 3-dimensional chess that I'm going with here?
Yeah, I think probably part of the reason is that Pakistan's at least theoretically a nuclear power. So I think that's probably part of the reason that they've been so sheltered from this. I definitely think that the U.S. should be doing more to address Pakistan's support of the Taliban. But obviously, it would have been a pretty bloody exercise to go into a country as large as Pakistan and try to, throw out their government. And you do run the risk of getting something worse than what you already have. So, like, you go in and have Iraq and you get rid of the Iraqi government, and then as soon as you leave you get ISIS. So
right, and the stakes for Pakistan would be much higher than that.
Yeah, so I think that pendulum has swung too much the other way in terms of like non-intervention, but also
I don't know, this week I think may have swung the pendulum the other way, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. But at least prior to this week there was sort of the thought that, oh well, let's just get along and we don't really need to have military intervention. And I guess I'm enough of a neocon to say, well, no, there are times that I don't think that the U.S. should be exploiting other people's resources, but there are times that a U.S. military presence is stabilizing for a region and is improving human rights in the region and protecting our interests against terrorism getting established. But also to invade Pakistan and set up a different government that would be a huge cost, and I would have to think about that more before I would.
Right.
Wouldn't.
Um,
I mean, I definitely see your point. I definitely agree that would be a root cause, but also it's fine to have an academic exercise and say, oh, what would it take to like topple the Pakistani government? But then the question is, now what do you do afterwards? How do you get a better government set up? And that can obviously be easier said than done.
Right.
And also you could start a nuclear war in the process. So
yeah. The other going on is that apparently Osama bin Laden was actually hiding out in Pakistan instead of Afghanistan at the time that he was murdered, or that he was brought to justice.
Yeah, that is true. Pakistan is absolutely harboring terrorism, but the thing is, we haven't even tried sanctioning Pakistan and saying, look, we know what you're doing and you've got to stop or you're not going to get any money from the rest of the world. I mean, we haven't even tried like diplomatically addressing this.
Yeah.
So that's why, I mean, it's like we maybe say, oh, well, the cost would be too high to invade Pakistan, so we'll just have to keep giving them all this money to support terrorism and not do anything about it. I mean, there really is a middle ground here where you apply some international and diplomatic pressure without like actually marching in there and trying to topple the government with a bloody war.
Right. I want to end on a positive note. At the same time that all of this horrific events have been taking place in Kabul, the Taliban has actually lost some territory in the Panjshir Valley. There's a resistance force that has actually taken back some towns in a small sliver of Afghanistan, I think in the Panjshir Valley. And I think they include like people from the old Northern Alliance from before the U.S. invaded that are part of this resistance that have actually, again, have managed to take back some territory. So can you speak to what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the one ray of hope. I guess whether or not they stand any chance is going to depend in part on whether the world comes up with some under the table support for them. I mean, because the Taliban now has a nice air force, for example, compliments of the U.S. taxpayers. So I have hope for that, in that I hope that there will be some way that Western countries will work behind the scenes to support the resistance and to like and to at least force the Taliban to leave some of those provinces alone. There's also some thinking among Afghan friends. They've said that part of what's going to determine how much resistance there is to the Taliban is going to be how brutal they are. So if they start like just mass executing people, then if people have no hope of being able to live under the Taliban, then they're going to be more motivated to join a resistance, because then it's like, well, I'm going to die anyway, so might as well die with honor. But if people feel like, well, yeah, we can get along with the Taliban here, then they're not going to be as motivated. So yeah, I think that it is a ray of hope, but it's really kind of remains to be seen what will happen. I hope that at least there will be a few provinces that will get enough support that it may end up being sort of like the autonomous region in Syria, where they don't get their own country, but at least there are some small areas that have a better quality of life.
Myanmar, Myanmar, where there's like isolated areas that are not under the government's control.
Yeah, so I mean, I hope at least it'll be that, because however, I don't know exactly what the population of those provinces are, but at least some of the people living in those areas will be at less risk than like the rest of the country is. So yeah, I hope for that, but it does really remain to be seen what's going to happen there.
Well, we can only hope for the best. Kristy, thank you so much for coming on. Hope we can have you back, because if the situation keeps changing, we're going to need to have you back on the show.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Nice to talk to you.